Economic pressures are forcing many companies to downsize or to restructure. Now, quiet firing has emerged as a means of pushing employees to quit by frustrating them with no coaching, support or career development. But what is it really? Let's discuss this trend with Debbie Goodman, who is the CEO of Jackhammer Global, and she joins us all the way from Los Angeles in the US, where it's around midnight right now. Debbie, thank you so much for your time this morning, your evening. Here in South Africa, we know about constructive dismissal. Tell us what's the difference between quiet firing, which I believe is quite a trend in the US, and constructive dismissal.
Okay, so let's start with constructive dismissal, because that is essentially when there is a change in work circumstances that is in contravention of your employment contract. And that could be, for example, when there is a change in your role, or a change in your reporting structure, or a change in your salary that companies have decided to change the remuneration policy. Anything that you can look at a change and then compare it with your existing work agreement, your service agreement, your employment contract, and note that there's very clearly a dissonance between those two things, and then can prove, because there's evidence, that would usually be a case for constructive dismissal. Quiet firing is something a little more insidious. It's much more difficult to pin it down as constructive dismissal because it's a little more subtle. It could be, for example, and this is where the trend is really coming in the US, is organizations have decided to call people back to the office 5 days a week, often when people have relocated and moved to different cities, moved very far away from a head office, and now all of a sudden, with relatively limited notice, are being called back into the office. Now, that in certain instances has been, instead of going through a process where you would need to go through a restructure with almost a retrenchment process, in South Africa we'd call it Section 189, which is costly, time-consuming, and is something that companies want to avoid. Instead, they make the work circumstances so unpleasant that people are miserable enough to resign instead of having to pay out severance packages or retrenchment packages.
Now, let's look at it from both sides of the spectrum. Let's start in the position of an employer or somebody in management. Some might say, you know what, I'm dealing with an employee that's very difficult to work with. Performance management is going to take too long, Debbie. Let's just do this quiet firing thing. Or there's some employers that we believe don't even know that this is what they're doing and that it's called quiet firing. What are we seeing in terms of the trend from an employer side?
Look, certainly, I think that we all either have experienced it ourselves, or we know a colleague, friend, family member who's experiencing what they refer to as a toxic workplace or a toxic work culture. And sometimes it's intentional, sometimes it just happens, and managers are actually unaware of how poor they are actually at managing and leading people, and just their work environments are awful and horrible, and people are miserable and disengaged. But certainly, sometimes people are earmarked for pushing into the corner as opposed to entirely out the door. And that can be what you'll be able to see this when people are passed up for promotion periodically, or they are not included in team events or committees, or not given opportunities to progress, when they don't get feedback or support, but nevertheless are continually told that they're not performing, where there's increased micromanagement. You'll often hear this from people where they say, we've got a new manager or leader, and now all of a sudden there's this, I'm being micromanaged. And then also you'll hear this too, where people are feeling either completely overworked and to the point of burnout, or they've just got meaningless paper pushing nonsense work to do and are absolutely bored out of their minds. All of these are instances where you can't exactly say, well, this is constructive dismissal, but it certainly is a route to absolute unhappiness, and is a way, if an employer prefers to skirt around the edges, they could make a workplace and a work situation pretty miserable for an individual or a team.
Now let's look at it from an employee point of view. Somebody might be watching right now and saying, wait a minute, this is starting to sound very familiar. What should people be looking out for if they suspect they might be on the receiving end of quiet firing? And what are their rights? What should their first steps be to try and deal with that situation?
Goodness, I knew you were going to ask this question, and it's a really tricky one because sometimes what's going on is, as I said, insidious. Sometimes it's not entirely overt. Nevertheless, and it's often very difficult to have evidence and prove that there is a case for constructive dismissal. In these instances, it's really hard to go to the CCMA, which is something that one could do if there was a clear case of constructive dismissal. And so if somebody is listening and they're going, oh, is that what's actually happening here? I feel like I'm being really sidelined. Or is it because this company doesn't want me here anymore? Or there's a manager that has got it in for me? One could certainly start documenting, writing down instances when these kinds of situations are arising. Talk to HR about it. Make sure that you have some kind of evidence. Maybe they're witnesses that could, be willing to stand and vouch for you. But this is the same advice I give to people who say I'm in a very toxic work environment. It's very, very hard to change that situation from within. And what I would say is, instead of thinking that you're going nuts and crazy, if you can see that this is actually something that's in your workplace, I would probably most recommend that you start thinking about alternatives. It's a harsh reality, but it's a very tricky thing to change once you're there. It's very hard to get evidence in order to take something to go the legal route. And so I don't like people to walk away with their tail between their legs ever, but I also want people to look after their own mental health all the time, and sometimes recognizing that it's not you. Something's happening in your work environment, and then actually starting to think about, okay, let me get a reality check on the situation and start thinking about what my alternatives could be.
Debbie, I just realized, I think the last time we chatted, we were speaking about this global trend of quiet quitting, which was kind of one of those trends that came out of our movement out of lockdown, and what impact that was having on our employer-employee relationship, and also what we see as being a healthy workspace. Now you're telling me about quiet firing. I thought we'd learned about how to avoid toxic workplaces, and it's one of the very important lessons we learned about healthy employer-employee relationships during this awful time of lockdown that we were in. What else are you going to tell me that we've learned? Because it looks like we've taken a few steps back after all of those very good learnings out of lockdown.
Goodness, from your lips to the powers that be, it would be my greatest wish that we could all have the opportunity to work in healthy workplaces where we are engaged and are working with good colleagues and peers and managers. That's still certainly an ambition of mine. So this term, the quiet firing, is actually a play on the quiet quitting. So yes, 100%. It's not entirely disconnected. And the first came out of the scenario where people were just checking out mentally, emotionally from their work environments. And so that was an employee tactic to sort of survive a work environment where they were not happy. And this is from a phrase. It's a play on that, but there's nothing funny about these situations. So absolutely. I think that what has arisen, and why do we keep hearing about, I don't want to overuse the word toxic, because not every workplace where there's a high performance culture where low performance is not tolerated, that should not be considered toxic if poor performers are pushed out the door. That's the work culture, and so be it. I think what we are starting to become aware of, and people are becoming more outspoken about, is when there is activity that results in gaslighting, when employees are, when there's some kind of like emotional abuse in the workplace. And I certainly, very unfortunately, do see this happening at all levels of organizations, and it is a very damaging, it's a very damaging process for people, and often even its top performers will sometimes get caught completely unawares. A new leader will come in, will have a different style and a different approach, and will sometimes their entire career have been top performers, and then all of a sudden be gaslit into believing that all of a sudden they are crazy and the brunt of a of kind of an emotionally abusive tactic or strategy from usually a manager, which is terribly unfortunate.
Well, something to keep an eye on in our very important workspaces where we do spend so much of our time. Thank you so much. Debbie Goodman is the Group CEO of Jack Hammer Global, joining us all the way from Los Angeles in the United States this morning. We thank her for her time and her insight today. Now to this, doctors who examined